The Godfather makes the Mafia look like a family business with rules. Don Vito speaks softly, settles disputes over dinner, and treats violence as a last resort. Michael Corleone agonizes over every decision he makes. The men around them have a code, an honor, and a sense of loyalty that runs deeper than blood. But the real men who handled the dirty work for the American and Sicilian crime families were nothing like that. They were not reluctant warriors weighed down by tradition. They were paid contractors who turned the simple act of taking a life into a system, an industry, and in some cases, a personal hobby they openly enjoyed. These were not characters in a film. These were real men who left behind real victims and real prison sentences that will outlast everyone reading this. Today, we are covering the real Mafia Hitmen, whose actual lives were far darker than anything Hollywood has ever put on a screen. Section 1. Roy DeMeo and the Gemini Crew, the Butcher of Brooklyn. In the movies, the Mafia has rules. Don Corleone in The Godfather speaks with calm authority, settles disputes over dinner, and treats death like a last resort. Roy Albert DeMeo had no such rules. By the time the law caught up with him, the federal task force investigating his crew called it the most violent crime crew ever prosecuted in federal court. Roy was born in Brooklyn on September 7, 1940. His parents had come from a small town in Italy called Formia, and they raised him in a working-class neighborhood called Flatlands. From the age of 15, Roy worked at a local grocery store where he trained as an apprentice butcher. He learned how to cut meat, how to break down a carcass, how to be efficient with a knife. That skill, learned over a counter at a normal job, would later become the most chilling part of his story. He graduated from James Madison High School in 1959. One of his classmates, oddly enough, was a young man named Bernie Sanders, the same Bernie Sanders who would one day run for President of the United States. Even as a teenager, Roy was already running a small loan business on the side. He would lend money at high interest and collect by force if he had to. By the time he was in his early 20s, this side business had caught the attention of a Gambino crime family soldier named Anthony Gaggi, who went by the nickname Nino. In 1966, Nino approached Roy and made him an offer. If Roy came to work for the Gambinos, Nino said, he could make far more money than he was making on his own. Roy agreed. From that moment on, his life had only one direction. Through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, Roy built a crew of young men around him. The first was a 16-year-old named Chris Rosenberg, who Roy met when Rosenberg was selling small amounts of marijuana at a gas station in Canarsie. Roy lent him money to buy in larger quantities, and the partnership grew from there. Rosenberg brought in his friends. Soon, Roy had around 20 men working for him, including Anthony Center, Joseph Testa, Henry Borelli, Frederick Denome, and his own cousin, Joseph Guglielmo. They were involved in stolen cars, loan sharking, drug dealing, and adult entertainment rackets. The crew operated out of a small bar in Brooklyn called the Gemini Lounge, located at 4021 Flatlands Avenue. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary neighborhood spot. Inside, it was the headquarters of one of the deadliest crews in American Mafia history. Federal authorities have estimated that the DeMeo crew was responsible for as many as 200 deaths between roughly 1973 and 1983. Many of those people were never found because Roy and his crew developed a method for making sure they never would be. The first man Roy is believed to have killed was a businessman named Paul Rothenberg in July 1973. Rothenberg had been paying protection money to the crew, but he had spoken to police investigators. Roy was given the order to handle it. He led Rothenberg into an alley in Roslyn, Long Island, and shot him twice in the head. From there, the killings only multiplied. Some were ordered by his superiors in the Gambino family, some were drug rivals, Some were people Roy or his crew simply decided had become a problem. Roy lived a double life that even his own family did not fully understand. He had married a woman named Gladys Britton in 1960, and they had 3 children together. They lived in a custom-built home in Massapequa Park on Long Island, in a quiet neighborhood with manicured lawns and other middle-class families. To his neighbors, Roy was a businessman who said he worked in construction, food retail, and used cars. He went to his daughter's school events. He attended birthday parties. His son Albert later wrote a book about him called For the Sins of My Father, in which Albert described his childhood as completely normal. Albert had no idea what his father did when he left the house. That double life cracked open in April 1979. A teenager named Dominic Ragucci, 18 years old and a college student, was working a summer job going door to door selling vacuum cleaners to pay his tuition. He happened to park outside Roy's home in Massapequa Park. Roy, paranoid that a Cuban drug crew was hunting him at the time, looked out and assumed Dominic was an assassin. Roy and 2 members of his crew chased Dominic in their cars for nearly 7 miles down a Long Island highway. When they finally caught up to him, Roy shot him to death. According to Albert, Roy came home that day, found out who Dominic really was, and broke down. He did not eat for days. But he kept killing. By 1982, the federal government was closing in. One of Roy's own men, Vito Arena, had been arrested for unrelated robberies and had started telling investigators everything. Roy knew his time was running out. He stopped leaving the house except when absolutely necessary. He wore a long coat with a sawn-off shotgun hidden underneath. He told his son that if anything ever happened to him, it would be from the people he trusted most. He was right. On January 10, 1983, Roy went to a meeting at a fellow crew member's house and never came home. 10 days later, on January 20th, his car was discovered at a Brooklyn Boat Club parking lot. His body was in the trunk. He had been shot in the head several times. He was 42 years old. But Roy DeMeo was not the most prolific assassin in Mafia history. Not even close. While Roy was running his crew out of a Brooklyn bar in the 1970s and 1980s, another man across the city had already turned contract killing into something even more organized, decades before Roy was even born. Section 2. Harry Strauss and Murder, Inc. The company that killed for a fee. Decades before Roy DeMeo opened the doors of his Brooklyn bar, the American Mafia had already created something most people would not believe was real if it appeared in a film. It was an actual organization with a head office, a payroll, and a phone number that existed for one purpose only. Its members were paid to handle the dirty work for the bigger crime families. The newspapers later gave it a name that stuck for the rest of history. They called it Murder, Inc. Murder, Inc. was put together in the late 1920s and early 1930s during the era of Prohibition, when American crime was being reorganized into something more structured and businesslike. The bosses of the big New York crime families needed a way to settle problems without putting their own most valuable men at risk. So they created an in-house team of contract men. The team was based in the Brownsville neighborhood of Brooklyn, and it operated out of a small candy store called Midnight Roses. By the time the law finally broke it open in 1940, federal estimates suggested that Murder, Inc. had been responsible for somewhere between 400 and 1,000 deaths over the course of about 10 years. They operated for so long and so quietly because nobody who knew anything about them was willing to talk. The most efficient man working for Murder, Inc. was Harry Strauss. He had been born in July 1909 to a Jewish family in the Russian Empire, and his parents had brought him to America in 1914 when he was only 5 years old. The family settled on the Lower East Side of Manhattan and later moved to the Bronx. His father worked for the city's Department of Street Cleaning and was killed in an industrial accident when Harry was around 8 years old. By the age of 15, Harry had dropped out of school. He was already drifting into a life on the streets. Most of his friends called him Pep. Because he had energy, he was sharp, and he carried himself like he was always ready for action. The newspapers called him something else. They called him Pittsburgh Phil. The strange thing was that he had never been to Pittsburgh in his life. The nickname stuck anyway. Harry was not the kind of man people expected to be a contract assassin. He was tall, lean, good-looking, and famously well-dressed. He wore $60 suits during the Great Depression, when most working men in New York could not afford a 60-cent meal. The police commissioner of New York City at the time, a man named Louis Valentine, once pointed Harry out in a lineup and said something the newspapers loved to repeat. He pointed at Harry and said, "Look at him, the best-dressed man in the room, and he has never worked an honest day in his life." What set Harry apart from other men in his line of work was a single rule he followed almost religiously. He never carried a weapon on him. He had been arrested 18 times by the New York City police on charges ranging from assault to theft to drug dealing, and not once had he ever been convicted. He understood that part of the reason was simple. If the police stopped him, they could not find anything to use against him. So when Harry traveled to a job, he carried only a small bag with a change of clothes. When he arrived at the location, he would look around for whatever was already there: a length of rope, a tool from a workshop, an item from a kitchen, anything common and easy to leave behind. He was paid by the job, with rates that ranged from $1,000 to $5,000 depending on who the target was. For an out-of-town job, the local crime family would simply call New York and request him by name. Harry would pack his small bag, take the train, complete the assignment, and be home by the next day. Harry once described his career to a friend in a way that reveals exactly how he thought about it. He said he was like a baseball player. He said he figured if he kept doing these jobs, somebody from one of the big crime families would notice him, and then he could move up to the major leagues. That is not how a normal person speaks about ending lives. But by all accounts, Harry was not a normal person. The men who worked alongside him said he genuinely seemed to enjoy the work. He volunteered for assignments that were supposed to be passed to other men. He went out of his way to be the one who got the call. Authorities later linked him to at least 28 separate cases in New York alone, and police departments from Connecticut all the way to California identified him in roughly 28 more. Some historians have argued the true number could be as high as 500, although the lower estimate of around 100 is the figure most often used in serious mafia history books. He worked alongside other infamous Murder, Inc. men, including Martin Goldstein, who went by the nickname Bugsy, and a short, twitchy Brooklyn-born man named Abe Reles, who went by Kid Twist. For most of the 1930s, Harry seemed completely untouchable. He was arrested over and over again, and every single time, the witnesses either disappeared, refused to testify, or changed their stories. The Brooklyn District Attorney's Office described him as a man who had never even been convicted of smoking on a subway platform. To the public reading the newspapers, it looked like Harry was simply too clever to ever be caught. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The truth was that Harry was not as untouchable as he believed. The thing that finally brought down Pittsburgh Phil and the entire Murder, Inc. operation came from the inside, from somebody who knew where every single body was buried. That somebody was a short, square-shouldered Brooklyn killer who had decided that talking to the police was now safer than staying loyal. Section 3. Abe Reles, the canary who could not fly. The man who finally tore Murder, Inc. apart did not do it with a gun or a courtroom subpoena. He did it with his mouth. He talked and talked, and once he started talking, He could not seem to stop. And what came out of him over the next 18 months stunned every single person in the room, including the seasoned prosecutors who had been chasing the New York Mafia for years. His name was Abe Reles. Most people knew him as Kid Twist. He was born in May 1906 in the Brownsville neighborhood of Brooklyn, the son of Jewish immigrants who had come to America from a region called Galicia in Eastern Europe. His father worked in the garment trade for a while, and later sold a kind of Eastern European baked snack called knishes from a street cart in Brownsville. The family had almost nothing. Abe attended school only through the 8th grade, and by the time he was a teenager, he was hanging around pool halls and candy stores and getting into trouble. His first arrest came in 1921, when he was just 15 years old, for stealing about $2 worth of gum from a vending machine. He was sent to a juvenile institution in Dobbs Ferry, New York for 4 months. Abe was short. He was square-shouldered. He was not the kind of physical presence anyone would walk past on the street and remember. But the men who worked alongside him understood very quickly that he was something different from the rest of them. He was completely without hesitation. He had a temper that would explode over things that were almost too small to mention. There was one story, told by Mafia historians and confirmed in old newspaper accounts, where Abe attacked a worker at a car wash because the man had failed to clean a small mark off the side of his car. Another time, he ended the life of a parking attendant for taking too long to bring his vehicle around. These were not calculated Mafia decisions. These were moments of pure rage from a man who simply did not care what came next. Through the late 1920s and into the 1930s, Abe rose through the Brooklyn underworld alongside his 2 childhood friends, Martin Goldstein, who went by Bugsy, and Harry Strauss, who would become known to the world as Pittsburgh Phil. The 3 of them worked together in the slot machine racket, then in loan sharking, then in labor racketeering, and eventually they all ended up working for the Murder, Inc. operation that the bigger crime families had set up out of that candy store in Brownsville. The early part of Abe's career was defined by a feud with a group of Brooklyn brothers named the Shapiros, who had originally controlled the rackets in his neighborhood. After several attempts on his life, including one where his girlfriend was assaulted in retaliation, Abe set out to wipe them off the map. Over the course of about 3 years, he handled all 3 Shapiro brothers personally, including the youngest brother, William, whose body was eventually found buried in the Canarsie section of Brooklyn after the men who had taken him there were spotted by a passerby and forced to flee. In 1934, Abe was arrested alongside Harry Strauss for an attack on 2 men working at a Brooklyn garage. He was convicted of a lesser charge and sentenced to 3 years in prison. The judge in that case said something at sentencing that would haunt Abe for the rest of his life. The judge described Abe as a man more dangerous than even John Dillinger, the famous American outlaw of the era, but said that Abe lacked the courage of a man like Dillinger. That comment stung. People who knew Abe later said he never forgot it. By 1940, the law had finally started to close in. A different Murder, Inc. man named Harry Rudolph had told a Brooklyn district attorney named William O'Dwyer the names of several people connected to old killings, and from that one thread, the entire operation began to unravel. Abe was arrested. He was looking at the electric chair. He had a wife named Rosie and 2 children, including a baby son. And he made a decision that no high-level man in the New York underworld had ever made before him. He sent a short letter from his cell to the district attorney's office. The letter said, simply, that he wanted to talk. What followed was unlike anything American law enforcement had ever experienced. Abe possessed what observers called a near-photographic memory. He could recall names, dates, addresses, conversations, and locations from years earlier with extraordinary clarity. Court stenographers struggled to keep up with him for weeks. He gave investigators the inner workings of an operation that the public had not even known existed until he started speaking. He named the men who had carried out hundreds of killings across the country. He explained how the contracts were assigned, how payments were made, where the bodies had ended up. The phrase the public learned to associate with him, contract, was a word that came directly from his testimony. His information sent his own boss, the labor racketeer Lepke Buchalter, to the electric chair at Sing Sing prison. It also sent his childhood friends, Pittsburgh Phil and Bugsy Goldstein, to the same chair. It sent Louis Capone, Mendy Weiss, Frank Abbandando, and Harry Maione to the same fate. To this day, Lepke Buchalter remains the only top-level American mafia figure to ever be formally executed by the United States government, and the case against him was built almost entirely on the words coming out of Abe Reles. But the biggest target was still ahead of him. The man Abe was scheduled to testify against on the morning of November 12, 1941, was the most powerful enforcer in the entire national crime syndicate. A man who had survived multiple murder charges in the past because every witness against him kept disappearing. Section 4. Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner. The man Abe Reles was about to point at in court was the same man who had built Murder, Incorporated from the inside. He was the one who had handed out the contracts for over a decade. He was the one who had decided who lived and who did not. His name was Umberto Anastasio, but the world knew him as Albert Anastasia, and to the people who feared him most, he was simply the Lord High Executioner. He was born on September 26, 1902, in a small town called Parghelia in the Calabria region of southern Italy. His father was a railway worker who died after the First World War, leaving behind a widow and 9 children. Albert was one of 7 brothers and 1 sister. The family had nothing. There was no future for them in that small Italian town, and Albert knew it. In 1919, when he was just 17 years old, he and 3 of his brothers boarded a freighter as deckhands, sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, and when the ship docked in New York, they simply walked off and never came back. They were illegal immigrants with no paperwork, no English, and no plan. They went straight to the Brooklyn waterfront and started working as longshoremen, the men who load and unload cargo from ships. Within 2 years, Albert was already in serious trouble. On March 17, 1921, he was convicted of ending the life of a fellow longshoreman named George Torino during an argument over work. He was sentenced to death and shipped up the Hudson River to Sing Sing prison to wait his turn for the electric chair. He should have died right there at 19 years old, but a legal technicality forced the court to grant him a retrial. By the time the new trial date arrived in 1922, 4 of the original prosecution witnesses had simply vanished. Without their testimony, the case fell apart. Albert walked out of prison a free man. That experience taught him something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Witnesses could be made to disappear. And if they could not be made to disappear, they could be made to forget what they saw. He was charged with another homicide in 1928 in Brooklyn. The witnesses either vanished or refused to speak. He was charged again in 1932, this time for an attack with an ice pick. The case was dropped for lack of witnesses. He was charged once more in 1933 for ending the life of a man who worked at a laundry. Once again, no one would testify. By the time Albert reached his early 30s, he was untouchable. He had also become close to some of the most important men in the American underworld, including Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, and Vito Genovese. These were the men who would soon reshape the entire structure of the American Mafia. In April 1931, Luciano made his move against the old-style Italian boss Giuseppe Masseria, also known as Joe the Boss. They lured Masseria to a restaurant on Coney Island, and during a card game, Luciano stepped away to use the bathroom. Albert and 3 other gunmen walked in and ended Massaria's life right there at the table. With that single act, the old order of the American Mafia was finished, and a new generation took over. To reward Albert for his loyalty, Luciano gave him control of the most secretive arm of the new criminal organization he was building. Along with a labor racketeer named Lepke Buchhalter, Albert was placed in charge of the enforcement squad that operated out of that candy store in Brownsville, Brooklyn. The newspapers would later call it Murder, Inc. For his role in running it, Albert earned 2 of his most famous nicknames. They called him the Mad Hatter, and they called him the Lord High Executioner. For 10 years, Albert ran the contract operation while staying in the shadows. He gave the orders, but he rarely got close to the actual work. By the time Abe Reles flipped in 1940, Albert had every reason to be terrified. Reles knew everything. Reles could place him at the center of 2 specific cases, including the disappearance of a Brooklyn dock worker named Pete Panto, who had been trying to organize reform within the Longshoremen's Union. According to the federal investigator Edmund L. Mala, Albert offered a reward of $100,000 to have Reles silenced. That was an enormous amount of money in 1941. And on the morning of November 12th of that year, Reles fell to his death from the 6th floor window of his guarded hotel room. The case against Albert Anastasia collapsed completely. He never spent a day in court for it. The years that followed were good to him. He served briefly in the United States Army during the Second World War, was given American citizenship as a reward for his service, and was honorably discharged in 1944. He moved into a 25-room mansion in Fort Lee, New Jersey. In 1951, the boss of his crime family, Vincent Mangano, vanished and was never seen again. Mangano's brother, Philip, was found shot to death in a Brooklyn marsh on the same day. Nobody was ever charged in the case. Everyone in the underworld knew what had happened. Albert simply stepped into the empty chair and took over the family. But Albert had made too many enemies along the way. He had been selling memberships in the family for $50,000 each, which was a serious violation of mafia rules. He had been losing huge amounts of money on horse races, which made him moody and unpredictable. And his rivals, particularly Vito Genovese, decided he had to go. They quietly approached one of Albert's own captains, a quiet, careful man named Carlo Gambino, and offered him control of the family in exchange for his cooperation. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. On the morning of October 25, 1957, Albert walked into the barber shop of the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan, completely unaware that the most loyal men around him had already agreed to step aside. Section 5. Sammy the Bull Gravano, the underboss who broke the oath. When Albert Anastasia hit the floor of that barbershop in 1957, the family he had built up did not disappear with him. It simply changed hands. Carlo Gambino took it over, and over the next several decades, it grew into the largest and most powerful crime family in the United States. They came to be known as the Gambino family, and by the late 1980s, the man sitting at the very top of that family, the boss himself, was John Gotti, the famous Dapper Don, who smiled at television cameras as he walked in and out of court. But Gotti would not have stayed boss for long without the man right below him. That man was Salvatore Gravano, and almost everyone who ever met him called him Sammy the Bull. Sammy was born on March 12, 1945, in the Bensonhurst neighborhood of Brooklyn. His parents had come to America from southern Italy, and his father worked as a house painter while his mother helped run a small dress factory. The family was not rich, but they were not poor either. They lived a normal, working-class life. Sammy was the youngest of 5 children, and from the very beginning, school was not for him. He had dyslexia, which is a learning condition that makes reading and writing extremely difficult. His teachers did not understand it at the time, and they simply labeled him a slow learner. He was held back twice, once in 4th grade and once in 7th grade. He was bullied, and he punched school officials more than once. Eventually, he was sent to a special school for difficult children, and even that school refused to keep him. Just before his 16th birthday, his parents signed papers to let him drop out for good. The nickname came when he was 13 years old. Some older boys had stolen his bicycle, and Sammy went after them by himself, even though they were bigger than he was. A group of mafia men were sitting at a cafe across the street, watching the whole thing. After Sammy fought several of the older boys at once, the mafia men stepped in, got his bike back for him, and one of them said the kid fought like a bull. From that day forward, he was Sammy the Bull. Sammy was drafted into the United States Army in 1964 and served 2 years at Fort Jackson in South Carolina. He worked as a cook in the mess hall, rose to the rank of corporal, and was honorably discharged. When he came back to Brooklyn, the streets pulled him in fast. By 1968, he was running with a group called the Rampers, and through them, he was introduced to a Colombo crime family man named Tommy Spiro. By 1976, after years of small-time robberies and earning a name for himself, he was officially made into the Gambino family. He was now part of the inner circle of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the country. Sammy quickly proved himself. He went into the construction business with his brother-in-law, and within a few years, he was a multi-millionaire. He liked to say that he literally controlled Manhattan, that the biggest builders in New York City could not pour a concrete foundation without going through him first. He owned a popular nightclub in Brooklyn called the Plaza Suite that brought in thousands of dollars a week. He bought racehorses. He built a large estate for his family in rural New Jersey. He looked like a businessman, but everyone in the family knew exactly what he really was. By 1985, Sammy was at the center of the most important moment in modern American mafia history. The boss of the Gambino family at the time was Paul Castellano, the man who had taken over after Carlo Gambino died. Castellano was distant, suspicious of his own captains, and viewed by many in the family as out of touch. A captain named John Gotti decided Castellano had to go. Gotti pulled Sammy and another captain named Frank DeCicco into the plot. And on the evening of December 16, 1985, the plan went into motion. Castellano was scheduled to meet several captains at a place called Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street in Manhattan. Sammy and Gotti parked their car across the intersection and waited. Around 5:30 in the evening, Sammy spotted Castellano's car, picked up a walkie-talkie, and signaled the team waiting outside the restaurant. 4 men in long white trench coats and Russian-style fur hats stepped forward as Castellano and his driver, Thomas Bellotti, pulled up. It was over in seconds. Castellano never made it into the restaurant. Gotti drove past the scene calmly, looked down at Bellotti's body, and Sammy said 2 words. He said, "He is gone." Within a month, John Gotti was the new boss of the Gambino family, and Sammy was rising fast right alongside him. Over the next 6 years, Sammy would be promoted to captain, then consigliere, then underboss, the second highest position in the entire family. By his own later admission to federal prosecutors, he was personally involved in the deaths of 19 people during his career. The names included his own brother-in-law, Nicholas Sciabetta, who had embarrassed the family. They included his lifelong best friend, Louis Melito, who had complained too loudly about Gotti's leadership. They included his business partner, Louis DeBono. By 1990, Sammy was earning over $2 million a year just from the construction unions, and Gotti was receiving a large piece of it. But the FBI had been listening for years. They had hidden microphones in the social club where Gotti held his weekly meetings, and on December 11, 1990, they arrested Gotti, Sammy, and another captain named Frank Locascio. While in jail awaiting trial, Sammy was given the chance to listen to those secret tapes. What he heard changed everything. Gotti was on those tapes calling him greedy, blaming him for several of the family's most serious problems, and quietly setting him up to take the fall. That betrayal pushed Sammy to make a decision that no underboss of any New York family had ever made before him. Section 6. Greg Scarpa, the hitman on the FBI payroll. When Sammy Gravano made the decision to flip and cooperate with the federal government in 1991, it was treated as a once-in-a-lifetime event. Newspapers ran headlines about it for weeks. The boss of an entire crime family had never been brought down by his own underboss before. But what nobody outside a tiny circle of FBI agents knew at the time was that another Brooklyn man, a man even more dangerous than Sammy in some ways, had been quietly working with the federal government for nearly 30 years already. He had been doing it while running one of the deadliest crews in the entire Colombo crime family. His name was Gregory Scarpa, and the men who feared him most called him the Grim Reaper. Greg was born on May 8, 1928 in New York City. His parents were immigrants from a small village near the city of Treviso in northern Italy. He was raised in the Bensonhurst neighborhood of Brooklyn during the Great Depression, and as a child, he helped his father deliver coal around the city to make ends meet. By the 1950s, Greg had drifted into the Colombo crime family, possibly through his older brother Salvatore. He rose quickly through the ranks. He had the right combination of qualities for that world. He was sharp, he was extremely well-dressed, and he had absolutely no fear of finishing a job that needed to be finished. By the 1970s and 1980s, Greg had become the chief enforcer for Colombo boss Carmine Persico, also known as the Snake. Greg ran the Wimpy Boys Social Club in Brooklyn, where his crew operated their gambling, loan sharking, extortion, hijacking, and counterfeiting rackets. He carried $5,000 in cash on him at all times. He owned homes in Brooklyn, Staten Island, Las Vegas, and Florida, plus an apartment on Sutton Place in Manhattan. He had been married since the 1950s to a woman named Connie, with whom he had 4 children. He also had a separate 30-year relationship with a girlfriend named Linda Shiro, with whom he had 2 more children. According to Linda, Greg sometimes used to leave the numbers 666 on the pagers of his targets just before the hit, the biblical sign of the beast. By the FBI's own estimates, he was personally responsible for somewhere between 100 and 120 deaths over the course of his career. That career almost ended in March 1962. Greg was arrested for armed robbery and was looking at serious prison time. The FBI gave him a choice. Either he could go to prison, or he could become a confidential informant and feed them information from inside the Colombo family. Greg chose the second option. What began that day was a relationship between an active mafia killer and the United States government that would last nearly 3 decades, paying him an estimated $158,000 over time. The most extraordinary part of the partnership came in the summer of 1964. 3 young civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, had been registering black voters in Mississippi when they vanished. The FBI was certain they had been murdered by members of the Ku Klux Klan, but they could not find the bodies. Local witnesses were too afraid to talk. According to multiple sources, including Linda Shiro and investigative journalists who later examined the FBI files, the Bureau flew Greg down to Mississippi specifically because they knew he would use methods that no government agent could legally use. Greg and an FBI agent allegedly grabbed a Mississippi television salesman named Lawrence Byrd, who was also a secret Klansman, took him to a nearby army base, and forced him to reveal where the bodies had been buried. The FBI has never officially confirmed Greg's role in the case, and some researchers credit a Mississippi state trooper with actually obtaining the information from a different source. But the story of Greg's involvement was widely believed within both the Bureau and the underworld, and it became the basis for a famous scene in the 1988 movie Mississippi Burning. The FBI cut Greg loose as an informant in 1975 after a dispute over money. But in 1980, a new FBI agent named Lindley DeVecchio managed to bring him back into the fold. Over the next decade, the relationship between DeVecchio and Greg became extraordinarily close. They met alone in apartments and hotel rooms paid for by the Bureau. DeVecchio became a regular dinner guest at Greg's house. Greg gave the agent gifts, including, on one occasion, a hard-to-find Cabbage Patch Kid doll for DeVecchio's daughter. Other FBI agents grew suspicious. When Greg was caught running a major credit card scam in 1985, DeVecchio submitted a memo to the judge listing all of Greg's contributions to the Bureau, and Greg walked out with no prison time at all. Other Colombo members started wondering how their friend kept escaping serious charges. Some began to whisper that he must be working with the law. In 1986, Greg's life took a turn that nobody could have predicted. He had emergency surgery for stomach ulcers and refused to accept a transfusion from the hospital blood bank, insisting that he only wanted blood from people he trusted. One of the donors was a fellow Colombo associate named Paul Mile, a bodybuilder who had been sharing dirty needles to inject anabolic steroids. Mile had contracted HIV without knowing it. He passed it directly to Greg through the transfusion. From that day forward, Greg was a man living on borrowed time. But he kept it a secret from almost everyone, including his own family, telling them he had cancer instead. Even sick, even dying, even partially blinded after losing an eye in a 1992 shootout with two Lucchese family men, Greg kept hunting. During the Third Colombo War, a vicious internal conflict between two factions of the family in 1991 and 1992, Greg cruised the streets of Brooklyn looking for men loyal to a rival named Victor Orena. He is alleged to have shot a man named Vincent Fusaro while Fusaro was hanging Christmas lights on his own house. On May 6, 1993, Greg pleaded guilty to 3 murders and conspiracy to commit several more. By then, he was blind in one eye, weighed almost nothing, and was clearly dying. He was sentenced to life in federal prison, later reduced to 10 years because of his condition, and he died in a federal medical center in Minnesota on June 4, 1994. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But Greg was not the only mafia man who figured out how to use the police to his advantage during this era. There was another mob boss, an underboss in a different New York family, who took the idea even further. He did not just feed information to one government agent. He bought 2 of them outright. Section 7. Anthony Casso and the Mafia Cops. The underboss who bought 2 detectives. Greg Scarpa worked one FBI agent for 30 years and got information out of him. The man you are about to hear about did something nobody else in the history of the American Mafia had ever done. He put 2 active New York City Police Department detectives on his personal payroll, paid them $4,000 a month plus bonuses, and used them as part of his own crew. His name was Anthony Casso. The men around him called him Gas Pipe, after a heavy steel pipe his father had once used in fights when he was younger. Anthony was born on May 21, 1942, in the South Brooklyn neighborhood of New York City. His grandparents had come over from the Campania region of southern Italy in the 1890s. His godfather was actually a fully made captain in the Genovese crime family, so the connection to the underworld was there from the moment he was born. His father worked as a longshoreman on the Brooklyn docks, and Anthony followed him into the same job after dropping out of school at age 16. As a teenager, he and his friends used a rooftop in their neighborhood as a shooting range, firing pistols at targets, and Anthony became an excellent shot. He even made small money on the side by shooting predatory hawks for the local pigeon keepers in his area. By 1958, when he was just 16 years old, Anthony had been arrested for taking part in a gang fight against an Irish-American group from a nearby neighborhood. His father came down to the police station and tried to talk sense into him. It did not work. A Lucchese crime family captain named Christopher Furnari, also known as Christy Tick, noticed Anthony around this time and took him under his wing. Furnari let Anthony run a small loan sharking operation and used him as muscle for his gambling and drug rackets. In 1974, when Anthony was 32, he was officially made into the Lucchese crime family. He was paired up with another young rising mafia man named Victor Amuso, and the two of them worked together for the next 20 years. They led a burglary crew known as the Bypass Gang, which contained expert lockpickers, safecrackers, and alarm system specialists. Federal authorities later estimated that this single crew stole over $100 million from bank deposit boxes and vaults across New York and Long Island during the 1970s and 1980s. By 1987, after the entire Lucchese leadership was sent to prison in the famous Mafia Commission trial, Amuso took over as the new boss, and Anthony became his right hand. By 1989, he was promoted to underboss, the second highest position in the entire family. But Anthony had something nobody else in the New York Mafia had. In September 1986, he was the target of a hit ordered by a rival inside the Gambino family. Several gunmen ambushed his car. He survived. After he recovered, Anthony decided he needed to know everything the police knew, and the way to do that was to put police officers themselves on his payroll. Through a man named Burton Kaplan, who acted as a go-between, Anthony made contact with two NYPD detectives. Their names were Stephen Caracappa and Louis Eppolito. Caracappa was a senior detective working in the Organized Crime Homicide Unit, which gave him access to confidential files on every mob informant the police were running. Eppolito was a heavy-set detective who had grown up in a Gambino crime family household. His own father, his uncle, and his cousin had all been Gambino men. He had even written a book about his upbringing called Mafia Cop while he was still a working detective. Starting in 1986, Anthony paid the two of them $4,000 a month for confidential police information, plus bonuses for special jobs. The first job came in October 1986. A Gambino associate named James Hydell was suspected of being one of the men who had taken part in the failed hit on Anthony. Caracappa and Eppolito drove to the Toys R Us store on Flatbush Avenue in Brooklyn, where they spotted Hydell. They identified themselves as police officers, told him he was being arrested, put him in their car, and instead of taking him to a police station, they delivered him directly to Anthony at a garage in Brooklyn. Hydell's body was never found. Casso later told prosecutors that he paid the two detectives a $45,000 bonus for that single delivery. 2 months later, on Christmas Day of 1986, the detectives gave Anthony information about a different Gambino associate, also named Nicholas Guido, who they believed had been involved in the hit. The information was wrong. There were two men named Nicholas Guido in that part of Brooklyn, and the detectives had given Anthony details for the wrong one. A Lucchese hit team showed up at the home of a completely innocent 26-year-old telephone installation technician named Nicholas Guido on Christmas Day while he was sitting in his uncle's brand new car outside his mother's house. He was killed for nothing more than having the same name as his neighbor. The actual Nicholas Guido, who had been the intended target, lived for many more years. In November 1990, Caracappa and Eppolito did something even worse. They personally pulled over a Gambino captain named Edward Lino on the Belt Parkway in Brooklyn, in what looked like a routine traffic stop, and finished him off right there in his car. Anthony paid the detectives a $75,000 bonus for handling that one personally. Anthony was finally arrested in January 1993, found dripping wet inside the home of his secret girlfriend in New Jersey. Federal agents searched the house and discovered a notebook with a detailed list of every payment he had made and received, including monthly tribute money from every crew in the family. He pleaded guilty in 1994 to 70 crimes, including racketeering, extortion, and 15 separate murders, and tried to become a government witness. But he failed a lie detector test, kept lying to investigators, and was eventually dropped from the witness protection program. In 1998, a federal judge sentenced him to 455 years in prison. He died of complications from coronavirus in a federal prison in Tucson, Arizona, on December 15, 2020. The men around Anthony Casso were paid hitmen who killed for money and information. But there was another figure in the New York underworld who killed because he genuinely seemed to enjoy it. Section 8. Tommy Pitera, the quiet man with the library of killing manuals. The men in this story up until now were dangerous because of what they did. The man you are about to hear about was something different. Tommy Pitera was dangerous because of what he was. Federal investigators who built the case against him during the late 1980s have all said roughly the same thing across the decades since. Tommy was not just a mafia man who happened to take lives for the family. Tommy genuinely seemed to enjoy it. He studied it. He kept a library of manuals about it in his apartment. And by the time the law finally caught up with him, the prosecutors who handled his case said he was one of the most disturbing defendants they had ever brought to court. Thomas Pitera was born on December 2, 1954, in the Gravesend neighborhood of Brooklyn. His father, Joseph, was an Italian-American who ran a small wholesale candy business. As a child, Tommy was the exact opposite of the man he would later become. He was small. He daydreamed in class. He had an unusually high-pitched voice for a boy his age, and the other children at his junior high school made his life very difficult because of it. He was bullied so heavily that he was not even allowed to join the school baseball team. His response, which gives some insight into how his mind worked even at that age, was to break into the school after hours, steal all the team's equipment, and sell it to local fences in the neighborhood. He was caught and arrested as a juvenile, but his record was sealed because of his age. Around the same time, Tommy discovered the 1966 television show The Green Hornet, starring the actor Bruce Lee. Lee became his hero. Tommy started attending a martial arts school in the Sheepshead Bay area of Brooklyn, and within a few years, he was at the top of his class. Where other neighborhood kids were getting into street fights, Tommy was reading books on Japanese fighting strategy, lifting weights every day, and growing his hair down past his shoulders to look exactly like Bruce Lee. He started eating sushi long before it was common in Brooklyn. He immersed himself in Eastern philosophy. After winning a martial arts competition in Sheepshead Bay, Tommy actually moved to Tokyo for 27 months and trained under a master named Hiroshi Masumi in a centuries-old Japanese fighting style. He learned to use traditional Japanese weapons, including the tonfa, the nunchucks, and the katana sword. When his scholarship ran out, he took a job in a chopsticks factory just to extend his stay. By the time he came back to Brooklyn, the small, bullied kid was unrecognizable. He was lean, fast, dangerous, and absolutely silent in a way that frightened the men around him. The friends he started running with on the streets gave him a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life. They called him Tommy Karate. Tommy joined the Bonanno crime family during the late 1970s. The Bonanno family was the smallest of the 5 families of New York, but it was still a serious organization, and Tommy quickly became one of the most feared men inside it. He was assigned to a crew run by a captain named Frank Lino, and over the course of the 1980s, he rose to the position of made man and eventually captain of his own crew. The crew operated mainly out of the Bath Beach section of Brooklyn, and they specialized in three things. They sold large amounts of cocaine, heroin, and marijuana. They robbed other dealers and resold the product. And they handled paid hits for anyone in the family who needed them. According to the federal investigation that eventually brought him down, Tommy had developed a complete system for making people disappear. He had selected a wooded area in Staten Island near a wildlife refuge as his preferred burial ground because the soil was damp and the area was protected from future development. He studied books on anatomy, on dissection, on body decomposition. He kept a special toolkit just for the purpose of body disposal. He always buried remains deep enough that police dogs could not detect any scent. To make identification through dental records impossible, he separated the heads of his victims from the rest of the bodies and buried them in entirely different locations. Eventually, federal agents would dig up 6 of his victims from that single Staten Island location. The Drug Enforcement Administration began investigating Tommy in the late 1980s after his crew started accumulating bodies at an unusually fast rate. One of his own crew members, a man named Frank Ganji, was arrested for drunk driving in late 1989. While sitting alone in a holding cell, Ganji began going over in his mind every horrible thing he had ever seen Tommy do, and he made the decision right there to flip and tell the federal agents everything. On June 4, 1990, Tommy was indicted by a federal grand jury. He was charged with running a major drug operation and with 7 different murders. Investigators publicly stated they believed he might have actually been responsible for as many as 30 deaths overall. When DEA agents raided his Brooklyn apartment, what they found shocked even seasoned organized crime investigators. They recovered more than 60 automatic weapons, knives, and swords. They also found a personal library of underground manuals with titles such as The Hitman's Handbook and Kill or Be Killed, books that explained step by step how to track targets and how to dispose of remains. Tommy had also kept jewelry and other personal items belonging to people who had vanished. He had been collecting souvenirs. The trial began in 1992. Federal prosecutor David Shapiro asked the jury for the death penalty, calling Tommy heartless and ruthless, describing in detail how Tommy had once taken his time finishing off one victim by deliberately shooting him in 7 different parts of the body, one at a time. On June 25, 1992, the jury convicted Tommy on 6 of the 7 counts. They rejected the death penalty during sentencing deliberations. In October 1992, Judge Rina Raji sentenced Tommy to life in federal prison. According to court reporters in the room, Tommy actually smiled and gave a thumbs up to the press as the verdict was read. Tommy is still alive. As of recent records, he is serving his life sentence at a high-security federal penitentiary in Kentucky. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But while Tommy was building his graveyard in Staten Island, half a world away on the island of Sicily, another man was using a much older method to get rid of bodies, and his official kill count would dwarf anything ever recorded in Brooklyn. Section 9. Giuseppe Greco, the little shoe of the Sicilian Mafia War. The American Mafia families operated under rules. They had a commission. They had to ask permission before taking out a boss. They had to avoid hitting innocent civilians whenever possible. None of those rules existed for the Sicilian Mafia of the early 1980s. On the island of Sicily, the original homeland of organized crime, a faction of mafia men decided to start a war that would end up with more than 1,000 bodies in the city of Palermo alone. The man who personally handled the most assignments during that war was a quiet, thin, scholarly young man from a small town outside Palermo. His name was Giuseppe Greco, but everybody on the island just called him Pino. And by the time the dust settled, it was estimated that he had personally taken part in 80 separate hits. with some sources putting the true number as high as 300. Pino was born on January 4, 1952, in a small Sicilian town called Ciaculli, on the outskirts of Palermo. Ciaculli was a place where the mafia was almost the only employer, where every family knew which side of the law their neighbors stood on, and where being part of an organized crime group was treated as a normal career path. Pino's father was a mafia man himself, nicknamed Scarpa, which is the Italian word for shoe. Because young Pino was the son of Scarpa, the older men in the neighborhood started calling him Scarpuzedda, which in the local Sicilian dialect means little shoe. The nickname stuck for the rest of his life. The strangest thing about Pino, the thing that nobody who met him as an adult could ever quite reconcile, was that he had been a remarkable student in school. Teachers later told reporters that he had been gifted in Latin and Greek, the kind of student who easily could have gone to university and become a professor or a translator. But the family business pulled him in instead. According to other Sicilian mafia men who later became state witnesses, Pino started out as a young driver for a different Palermo boss before quickly working his way up. By the year 1979, when Pino was just 27 years old, he was already sitting on the Sicilian Mafia Commission, the small governing body that controlled organized crime across the entire island. The Sicilian Mafia at the time was split into two camps. On one side were the older Palermo bosses, men like Stefano Bontade and Salvatore Inzerillo, who had run the island for decades. On the other side was a faction from a small mountain town called Corleone, led by a man named Salvatore Rina, also known as Toto. Rina wanted absolute control over everything. He was willing to break every traditional rule the Sicilian Mafia had ever followed in order to get it. Pino chose Rina's side. From that decision came the bloodiest internal war in the history of the Sicilian Mafia. The war began on April 23, 1981. Stefano Bontade, the Palermo boss, was driving home in his Alfa Romeo on his birthday when a motorcycle pulled up alongside his car at a stoplight.
Pino, sitting on the back of that motorcycle, opened up with an automatic rifle and finished Bontade right there in the driver's seat. The AK-47 became Pino's signature weapon for the rest of the war. A few weeks later, on May 11th, he handled Salvatore Inzerillo the same way, ambushing him outside his girlfriend's apartment. Pino was the triggerman for both of the most important hits at the start of the conflict. What followed was something Sicily had never seen. Between 1981 and 1984, more than 400 mafia members were taken off the streets in the city of Palermo, with another 400 across the rest of Sicily. At least 160 more were classified as missing, never to be found. The Corleonesi faction, led by Rina and carried out largely by Pino and his hit team, won the war by overwhelming force. Pino worked alongside another Sicilian boss named Filippo Marchese, who ran a building in Palermo that pentiti, the Italian word for state witnesses, later described as a place where the Corleonesi would handle private business away from prying eyes. According to one later witness named Vincenzo Sinagra,
Pino and Marchese sometimes worked side by side on the same job. When Rina decided in 1982 that Marchese had outlived his usefulness, Pino was the one assigned to handle Marchese as well. But the Corleonesi did not stop with their fellow mafia rivals. They went to war with the Italian state itself. On July 29, 1983, Pino and an accomplice parked a small Fiat 126, packed with explosives, outside the home of an anti-mafia magistrate named Rocco Cinici in Palermo. The bomb detonated. Cinici, his two police escorts, and the porter of the building were all killed. The driver was the only survivor. The Sicilian Mafia had now declared open war on the Italian government, and Pino was at the center of it. In September 1982, Pino took part in the murder of an even higher-profile target. A retired Italian general named Carlo Alberto dalla Chiesa,
who had been sent to Palermo specifically to crack down on the mafia, was driving with his wife when motorcycle gunmen led by Pino's crew opened fire with automatic weapons. The general, his wife, and his bodyguard all died in the street. The killing shocked all of Italy. By 1984, Pino had become so prominent and powerful inside the Ciccioli organization that other young mafia men were starting to look up to him more than they looked up to Rina himself. That was a dangerous position to be in. Rina was not the kind of boss who tolerated rising stars beneath him. According to Salvatore Concemi, a Sicilian mafia man who later turned state witness, Rina decided that Little Shoe had become a problem. Sometime in September 1985, Pino was at home in Ciccioli when two men he had considered his close friends, Vincenzo Puccio and Giuseppe Lucchese, paid him a visit. They had been sent by Rina. Pino was finished off by his own friends inside his own house. According to other witnesses, his body was then dissolved in acid and disposed of completely, with Rina spreading the false story that Pino had simply gone into hiding in the United States. The truth did not come out until almost 4 years later, when an informant finally told investigators what had actually happened. But Pino was not the only Sicilian who took part in the war on the Italian state. The man who would inherit his role was even more brutal, and his single most notorious act would shock all of Italy. Section 10. Giovanni Bruska, the man who pushed the button. The last man on this list was a direct disciple of the killer you just heard about. He came up under the same Corleonese faction. He was raised inside the same culture, and he ended up doing something on May 23, 1992, that would shake the entire country of Italy and turn him into one of the most hated figures in modern European history. His name was Giovanni Bruska, but his nicknames in Sicilian mafia circles were less flattering. They called him the Pig because of his unkempt appearance, and they called him the People Slayer because of how casually he handled his work. Giovanni was born on February 20th, 1957, in a small Sicilian town called San Giuseppe Giotto, about 40 minutes outside of Palermo. He never had a chance at any other life. His grandfather and great-grandfather had both been made members of the Sicilian Mafia. His own father, Bernardo Bruska, was a regional mafia boss who later received multiple life sentences. When Bernardo was sent to prison in 1985, Giovanni, who was still in his 20s at the time, simply took over the family district. By his own later admission to Italian prosecutors, Giovanni took part in somewhere between 100 and 200 deaths during his career. He was a personal favorite of Salvatore Rina, the head of the Corleonesi. The act that made him infamous took place on the morning of May 23, 1992. The most respected anti-mafia prosecutor in Italy was a magistrate named Giovanni Falcone. Falcone had spent years building cases against the Sicilian mafia, including the famous Maxi trial of 1986 that resulted in the conviction of more than 300 mafia members at one time. Rina ordered Falcone removed. The job was given to Giovanni Bruska. For weeks, a mafia team tunneled underneath a stretch of motorway near the town of Capaci, just outside Palermo Airport. They packed 13 large drums with about half a ton of explosives and rolled them into place. Giovanni positioned himself on a hill overlooking the road, with a remote detonator and a pair of binoculars. When Falcone's 3-car convoy passed by, Giovanni pressed the button. The explosion was so massive, it registered on local seismic equipment as a small earthquake. Falcone, his wife Francesca, and 3 police escort officers all lost their lives that day. The attack stunned Italy and made global news. The Italian state responded with a major crackdown on the mafia. Hundreds of arrests followed. One of the men arrested, a former mafia member named Santino Di Matteo, became a state witness and gave investigators the entire inside story of the Capaci attack, including Giovanni's name. To try to silence DeMeo, Giovanni gave the order for one of the cruelest acts in modern Italian crime history.
On November 23, 1993, Mafia members dressed as police officers took DeMeo's young son Giuseppe from a riding stable, telling the boy they were taking him to see his father. He was held captive for 779 days. On January 11, 1996, Giovanni gave the order to end the boy's life, and his body was dissolved in acid. Giovanni's own brother, Enzo, carried out the act on his orders. The case shocked even other mafia members in Sicily. Italy never forgot it. On May 20, 1996, Giovanni was arrested at a small house near Agrigento, where he was having dinner with his girlfriend, his young son, and his brother. The investigators had pinpointed his exact location through a phone tap. When the police brought him into the Palermo station that night, dozens of officers cheered, honked car horns, and pulled off the ski masks they normally wore for protection. Giovanni later became a state witness himself. He confessed to roughly 100 separate killings, gave investigators the full inside story of the Capaci bombing, and provided enough information to send dozens of other mafia members to prison for life. As a reward for his cooperation, his original life sentence was reduced. After serving 25 years, he was released on parole on May 31, 2021. The decision sparked national outrage in Italy. He was finally fully discharged from supervision in June 2025. The men in this video came from different countries, different decades, and different sides of the law. But every one of them shared the same simple truth. The fictional mafia of films, the well-dressed men with their rules and their codes and their honor, has almost nothing to do with the real history of organized crime. The real men in those families left behind nothing but missing persons reports, prison sentences that will outlive the prisoners, and families who never got to say goodbye to the people they loved. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.